Hello everyone, how's it going? Welcome back. I'm glad you decided to click on this video because I've got something special for you guys today. We're ranking Game Boys. And yes, that means every Game Boy released from the original Game Boy in 1989, all the way through to the Game Boy Micro released in 2005. And the way we're going to do this is through a scoring system. So I've picked out the 4 most important factors to work out if a Game Boy is any good or not. And these are as follows. Firstly, we've got appearance. The Game Boy's got to look cool in order to get a good score in this video. Next up, we've got functionality. This just looks at what the Game Boy can do and how good it is at doing it. And I'm going to try keep it consistent with the time it was released because obviously the original Game Boy, having been released all the way back in 1989, probably doesn't quite have the functionality that the Game Boy Advance SP has. So I'm going to try my best to measure it at the time the system was released. Next up, we've got comfortability, which just looks at how comfortable is the system to actually use and play games on for an extended period of time. And finally, we've got the does it need to exist category. This essentially measures the need for the system at the time of its release and also looks a little bit at its overall lasting legacy. And once we've scored each system, we're just going to add the numbers together and get a score out of 40 and rank each Game Boy accordingly. Also, I think I forgot to mention this, but each category is scored out of 10. Alright, that's enough intro, let's get into it. The original Game Boy. Starting off with the appearance of this thing, there's no denying it. This is an iconic system. The red A and B buttons and the black D-pad are iconic and they look amazing. I'd even go further to say that the green screen on the original Game Boy plays a massive role in giving this really awesome, iconic look. I also like the shape of the Game Boy. In particular, I like that the bottom right corner is rounded while the other corners are a lot more sharp. I'm not sure if I really know why, but I just think it gives the overall shape of the Game Boy a really sleek appearance. So for all those reasons, I've got to give it a 9 out of 10. The original Game Boy looks amazing. Moving on to functionality, the Game Boy has definitely got some downsides. Firstly, every game is green because of that screen, which just looks a little bit funky, as well as that the screen itself isn't overly bright and is notorious for causing sprite blurring as well. It's got really nice stereo sound on it though, and also has a pretty damn good battery life. But I do think the functionality is quite limited because whilst the original Game Boy was released in 1989, there were no revisions made to the original Game Boy all the way through to 1996. So by the end of the original Game Boy's life, this system was severely lacking functionality wise. So for that reason, I've got to give it just a 4 out of 10. Moving on to comfortability, I love the form factor of the original Game Boy. The overall shape of it is amazing, which is why most of the Game Boys made after the original Game Boy actually do look very similar. It's because they pretty much got it right the first time around. It's nice and big and it's bulky, it just fits in the hands really well, and it's actually got a really nice weight to it. I think it weighs something like 200 grams without batteries, it just makes it feel a lot more premium in my opinion. So overall, I've got to give the comfortability a 9 out of 10. And for the does it need to exist category, there's no debate. It gets a 10 out of 10. The original Game Boy revolutionized handheld gaming. There is no doubt about it, and it is just absolutely iconic. So with that, the Game Boy gets a total score of 32. The Game Boy Pocket. Appearance-wise, the Game Boy Pocket maintains a pretty similar appearance to the original Game Boy. However, notably, it is considerably smaller, and as well as that, the Game Boy Pocket comes in a variety of different colors, which I really do think made the Game Boy Pocket have its own identity. It just really makes it stand out. So overall, I'm going to give the appearance an 8 out of 10. Functionality-wise, the Game Boy Pocket has a lot of improvements over the original Game Boy, but I don't don't think, for the time it was released in 1996, that it was truly a next-gen improvement over the original Game Boy. Don't get me wrong, it's nice to see that there's a new and better screen on the Game Boy Pocket. Obviously it's black and white now instead of green, and the screen also fixes the sprite blurring issue as well. But other than that, there's not really too much different, and for that reason, I'm gonna give it a 6 out of 10. Moving on to comfortability, it's got a similar shape to the original Game Boy, but it is a little bit smaller and a lot lighter. Don't get me wrong, the Game Boy Pocket is still very comfortable to hold, but due to it being that little bit smaller, I'm gonna give it an 8 out of 10. And for the does it need to exist category, the Game Boy Pocket gets an 8 out of 10 as well, because by the time the Game Boy Pocket was released, the original Game Boy had been around for about 7 years with no revisions, so it was in desperate need of an upgrade. And with that, the Game Boy Pocket gets an overall score of 29. The Game Boy Light. Appearance-wise, it looks very similar to the Game Boy Pocket, although it is notably just a little bit taller. So for that reason, I'm going to give it the same score at an 8 out of 10. Moving on to functionality, this is where the Game Boy Light really does shine. Actually, it's where it literally shines more, because it's got that backlit screen, which was just a majorly needed improvement to the Game Boy Pocket. Now you can actually play this thing at nighttime, which is a pretty big deal. However, other than that, it's got pretty much the same features as the Game Boy Pocket. It was only released 2 years after the Game Boy Pocket, and as well as that, it was also only released in Japan. So for that reason, I'm gonna give it an 8 out of 10 for functionality. Moving on to comfortability, since it's got pretty much the same form factor as the Game Boy Pocket, it's gonna get the same score at an 8 out of 10. And lastly, for the does it need to exist category, this is where the Game Boy Light really does fail. I feel like the timing of its release was just not right. It was released at pretty much the same time the Game Boy Color released. So for that reason, by the time it had come out, there was already an arguably better and more in demand Game Boy model on the market. Whilst the backlight is amazing, it just wasn't timed well. It would have been so much better if the Game Boy Light came out a year or two earlier. So for that reason, it's going to get a 3 out of 10. And that gives the Game Boy Light a total score of 28, placing it just behind the Game Boy Pocket. The Game Boy Color. Appearance-wise, it again looks pretty similar to the Pocket. Obviously, there are a few differences, but none of them are really notable enough to me to change the score. It does keep that OG Game Boy form factor, which was honestly just perfected from the start, so there wasn't really much reason to change it. So for that reason, it gets an 8 out of 10. Moving on to functionality, this is a bit of a difficult one because obviously the Game Boy Color gets that color screen, which, don't get me wrong, is amazing. But it also doesn't have the backlight, which sucks because there was the Game Boy Light, which was released at around the same time, that did have a backlight, so it really does detract from it. I feel like if the Game Boy Color had a backlight, this thing would be getting a 10 out of 10 any day of the week. But for that reason, I'm gonna have to give it a 7 out of 10 because I feel like a backlight is such a big deal, and this one didn't have one when a lot of other handhelds at the time did. Moving on to comfortability, again, it's got a very similar form factor to the previous model, so for that reason, it gets an 8 out of 10. And on the does it need to exist scale, it gets a 9 out of 10. And that is purely because of that color screen. You can't really deny how much of an upgrade that is. Going from black and white games to color is just a massive, massive change. So overall, that gives the Game Boy Color a total score of 33, placing it at the top of the list so far. Next up, we have got the Game Boy Advance, and this is where Nintendo finally changed from that OG Game Boy form factor, and I'm gonna say it, guys, I love the form factor of the Game Boy Advance. I think it is the most eye-catching model of every Game Boy, so for that reason, it gets a 10 out of 10. Moving on to functionality, this is unfortunately where the Game Boy Advance falls a little bit flat. I think the best function it has is the fact that it's got that backwards compatibility with Game Boy and Game Boy Color games. but it's got no backlight, which is just an absolute joke for 2001. There is no reason why the Game Boy Advance shouldn't have a lit screen. So for that reason, I have to butcher it on the functionality, and I'm going to give it a 3 out of 10. Moving on to comfortability, as I mentioned before, I absolutely love the look of this system, and I also love playing on it. It just fits in the hands perfectly. I think the change from the vertical layout of the original Game Boy to a horizontal layout is just awesome. I absolutely love the way it feels in the hands, and for that reason it gets a 10 out of 10. And on the doesn't need to exist scale, the Game Boy Advance gets a 9 out of 10. It was obviously a lot more powerful than anything that had come before it, and at the time the Game Boy really was in need for that performance boost, so for that reason it does get the 9 out of 10, and that gives the Game Boy Advance an overall score of 32, which places it equally with the original Game Boy and just below the Game Boy Color. Next up, we have got the Game Boy Advance SP, and based on appearance, again, this was a major change for the Game Boy line with that clamshell design. I do like the design, but not as much as the Game Boy Advance. I still do think it looks really sleek and also looks really modern for the time it was released in, so for that reason, I'm going to give it an 8 out of 10. Moving on to functionality is where the Game Boy Advance SP really shines. Depending on the model, it's either got a front lit or a backlit screen, but either way, at least the screen is lit, which was desperately needed for the Game Boy Advance line of consoles, and as well as that, it's actually the first Game Boy to have a rechargeable battery, so for that reason, I'm going to give the Game Boy Advance SP a 10 out of 10. Next up, for comfortability, this one's a little bit interesting because, in my opinion, it's too small and a little bit uncomfortable to actually hold, but I do think it actually has the best buttons of every Game Boy. They're just so clicky. They're just really fun to press the buttons, particularly the shoulder buttons. I feel like the shoulder buttons on the Game Boy Advance SP are just so satisfying to press. So for that reason, I'm going to give it a 7 out of 10 for comfortability. And for the doesn't need to exist category, the Game Boy Advance SP gets a 9 out of 10 because a lot of the quality of life improvements in this model were just desperately needed, and that gives the Game Boy Advance SP a total score of 34, placing the Game Boy Advance SP at the top of the list. Next up, we have got the Game Boy Micro, which was also the final Game Boy to be released. Appearance-wise, I love the Game Boy Micro. It's so small and unique, and just a cool collector's piece. There's not really much more to say about it. I just love what they did with it. So for that reason, I'm going to give it a 10 out of 10. Moving on to functionality, unfortunately, the Game Boy Micro kind of falls off a cliff. It loses that backwards compatibility and has a much smaller screen, although it is worth noting that it's a very nicely lit screen. I think, if I'm not mistaken, it's actually got a better screen than the AGS 101 Game Boy Advance SP models, but I might be wrong on that. And it's also worth noting that the Game Boy Micro cannot use the link cable. Not that that's really a big deal, but it's worth noting. So based purely on the reason that it loses a lot of key features and doesn't really add a lot other than the unique coolness of the look of the model, I'm going to have to give the functionality a 2 out of 10. Moving on to comfortability, the Game Boy Micro is not a system I'm keen on playing for long periods of time. It's just way too small. And not only is the system too small, but the screen's also too small. It's weird because I feel like the Game Boy Micro is not really for playing, it's more for like collecting. I don't know if other people share that opinion, but based on that, I'm gonna have to give it a 2 out of 10 as well. And unfortunately for the does it need to exist category, it doesn't get any better because the Game Boy Micro really didn't need to exist. I'm pretty sure it released just prior to the Nintendo DS's launch, so it was kind of just sandwiched in there at the end, and it didn't add any new features or anything like that, so for that reason, I'm gonna absolutely slaughter the Game Boy Micro here and give it a 1 out of 10, which places it comfortably at the bottom of the table with a total score of 15. So looking at the list, that means the Game Boy Advance SP is the best. There you go.